Russia has a plan to end the war in Ukraine, and according to at least one of their analysts, things are already on track to end the war this fall. Now, this was an assessment put together in a Russian think tank titled Russia in Global Affairs, which there is an English version of this. If you're interested, I'll put the link in the description below. It's so easy here in the United States as an English speaker to kind of limit the amount of resources you look at when trying to understand this conflict. Ukraine has done a pretty incredible job of putting out a ton of information in English. And of course, we have things that are published here in the United States. Russia doesn't have quite as much, I would say, that is published also in English. But, you know, the wonders of the modern internet, you can go to pages that are in Russian and have them translated. And if you're really trying to understand the overall conflict and the Russian viewpoint of where they think it's going and what they think is coming next, you got to go there. You got to go to some of their resources rather than relying entirely on kind of the Western breakdown of Russian analysts. So that's what we're doing here. The article is titled, "The West Knows Ukraine's Counteroffensive is Failing, so what is Plan B?" And this was published on September 13th, 2023, so pretty recent. Now, I don't know the quality or the ethical standards of this think tank. I mean, you know, in the United States, for instance, we've got a lot of challenges with our own think tanks being so heavily connected and funded by not just portions of the U.S. government, but also arms manufacturers. So, you know, take all of that into consideration. I just think it's an interesting viewpoint from a Russian analyst, if you will, as to what is coming next. He starts out by saying, "In the Western press, the main stories about Ukraine in recent weeks have been about how poor the Ukrainian army has performed and how strong the Russian army is in its defensive work. This means that Kyiv's counteroffensive, while not formally over, has been almost definitely written off." I don't know that I would say it's been written off, but he's spot on with how recent news in the United States and the West in general hasn't been as much about how poor the Ukrainian army's performed, but there has been a lot more, you know, recognition of just how challenging these Russian defenses have been to move through, which, look, there's no one to blame but ourselves for that. I mean, how many times over the past few months have you heard analysts, prominent analysts, say things like Crimea by summer, or we're going to wrap this thing up in the next 60, 90 days, a quick breakthrough, and the Russian lines are going to collapse and Ukrainian forces will race to the Sea of Azov. And, you know, we had satellite imagery, and there were a lot of people, I think, solid analysts looking at that and saying, you know, maybe, but realistically, this is probably going to be a slog, and it has. And in retrospect, I wish that a lot of these major outlets would have looked at the conflict and said, prepare for the long haul. This is going to be a real fight, instead of kind of predicting rapid success. They add that the results of 12 weeks of combat are thus: the first of the 3 Russian defense lines has been breached in a narrow area. 5 or 6 villages in the surrounding area have been taken, and most of the reserves prepared for the operation have been used up. This is going to be a theme in this piece, and it's kind of the elephant in the room. It's something that we don't know, quite frankly, saying most of the reserves prepared for the operation have been used up. In the opening days of the offensive, it was clear that only a portion of the Ukrainian reserves that had been set aside for this offensive operation had been used. At least in the weeks, maybe even a month or two after things kicked off, there was still a lot of talk about, hey, this isn't all of the brigades. There's still a lot of units that have not been put into the breach. Very hard to know right now, and this is going to be important as the article moves on, very hard to understand right now the overall strength of the Ukrainian military. It's hard to understand the strength of the Russian military as well. A little bit of this, we have to go back to, really big picture, talking about, the capabilities of a military force. Manpower is a portion of that. Over time, as you kind of expand out and need younger people or people with medical issues that maybe would not have qualified previously, or older people, the quality of the force can decrease over time. If we're looking at raw numbers, Russia is a much larger country and has a larger population to pull on. But look, it's a big unknown. I'm sure it's a conversation behind closed doors. What is the actual strength of the Ukrainian military today? The author continues, he says, the West's bet on a Ukrainian military defeat of Russia has clearly not worked. In general, a fragile balance, or stalemate if you prefer, has been established on the front line, leaving the question of military initiative and future of the conflict up in the air. I agree 100% with the second portion of that. There is a stalemate. We have seen Ukrainian forces advance in certain areas, 100%. They're relatively small, all things considered, compared to the overall size of the area that they're hoping to liberate from Russian forces. And if you step back, and I know people on both sides will get frustrated with this, the lines haven't drastically changed since last fall. It's been about a year now since we've seen any significant changes in the lines, right? Folks will say, well, look at all the territory Ukraine has retaken in the last 3 months, and it is something, and it's been an incredibly challenging fight, but in context of the overall war, it just hasn't been a lot, right? If that is the pace of Ukraine retaking territory, of course, it points to a long war, years, maybe decades. But the same goes for Russia. There's all the hype about Bakhmut and Popasna and Soledar, and they did take that territory. But if you look at how much territory Russia has taken since they lost Kharkiv and Kherson last fall, it's also not a lot. So neither side, while there is movement on the battlefield, it is not, significant changes in territorial control. The author continues, to have a chance of defeating Russia on the battlefield, the enemy must multiply its advantage over the Russian armed forces. To do this, it will have to double or triple military supplies, double or triple the number of troops, and be provided with hundreds of the latest aircraft with the most potent weapons. This is something I talked about briefly before this, probably 6-7 months ago, before this counteroffensive kicked off, was a challenge for Ukraine looking forward, is that if this doesn't work, if how the Ukrainian military is set up today and equipped today as in summer, fall 2023, if that's not enough to make significant progress on the battlefield, it's hard to envision a scenario where a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, the aid, the number of vehicles, the ammunition, all of that increases substantially, right? So if we look at what Ukraine has now as X didn't create, as of now, a major breakthrough in the Russian lines to recapture all the conquered territory or the occupied territory. If X didn't do it, will 2X? Will 3X? It's kind of what the author's getting at here, saying that the West has to multiply its advantage. I think that's a big ask at this point of the West. I'm not sure that's in the cards. I think we might even see, and I think we are seeing already, an argument as to whether the current level of aid should continue. Outside of like Poland and the United Kingdom, Estonia and a handful of other countries, it's hard to envision very many governments and populations looking at the conflict right now and saying double it, triple it. Or at least in the United States, I don't think that's in the cards, doubling or tripling. They continue saying, first, this would take several months, even assuming that Russia would stand by and not prepare a response. Doubling or tripling the aid to Ukraine is not a couple month proposition. That is, look how long it's taken to get some of this stuff there. Unless many of these countries, the United States included, truly deplete our inventories down to nothing, it's not going to be a few months. Realistically, it's right as we sit here right now. I think realistically, if somebody were to say, what is it going to take to double the Ukrainian military, that's probably a 12-month proposition. He says, secondly, the West is not at all keen on such a turn of events for the time being. The current level of its supplies ensure the replacement of the armed portion of Ukraine's losses and its ability to continue its defense at the current level of hostilities, so basically enough to stay afloat. There's a pessimistic side of me. I don't know if I've said this before. There's a pessimistic side of me that looks at, in the United States, I just have a better understanding kind of what's happening here than in other countries. The pessimistic side of me wonders if the goal here is to drag on the conflict as long as possible. There's a lot of talk early in the war, and continues to be, about this being Russia's Vietnam. Kind of skip right past the fact that they had that in Afghanistan in the 80s. But the idea that, it's not to collapse the Russian military in one major offensive operation or anything like that, but to just drain them, to bleed their economy, to force the brain power, and Russia's seen this, to see some of their top students, professors, academics, things like that leave the country because they don't want to have to go to war, and turn this into a 5-10 year debacle for Russia. That's not something that I would imagine anybody's going to say out loud, but the flow of equipment makes me wonder that in the back of my mind. Is the strategic play not the total collapse of Russia, but just to weaken them over the next decade? If you look at it in that context, it does kind of make sense why we've really just kind of been, it has not been an over-the-top everything Ukraine needs from day one. They continue on saying, is our general staff, this is the author speaking about the Russian general staff, preparing a major offensive this year, or will it prefer to continue playing defense? And this is going to be very interesting in the coming months because I don't know if Russia has the ability to kick off a major offensive. We haven't really seen that, right? If you take out Bakhmut and Soledar, and there are people talking about some of the offensive in the Northeast, but there's not been a lot there. Realistically, it's been relatively minor. There's been a fair amount of troops, but the territory changing hands just hasn't been significant. The fighting continues to be the fiercest in the south, where Ukraine is on the offensive. But Russia should have been, it appears they have been, replenishing their manpower, and they're not letting anybody go. So the conscripted soldiers and the contract soldiers, they're locked in now until this war is over. So the Russian military should be, from the outside looking in, growing in size. Will they use that to lock in the defense or push on the offense? The author continues saying, it seems that it makes sense to attack only with decisive objectives. And he gets into what the goals of the Russian military are here, which I thought was interesting. He says, we need a strategic defeat of the armed forces of Ukraine, which will allow us to impose our will on the enemy. To do this, we need a 2- or 3-fold advantage, which we do not seem to have at the moment. Gets right back into that manpower argument, right? And there's been so much speculation on that front. There's speculation on the casualty front, but also how many people, tanks, artillery pieces do each side have at the front? The author seems to think that the 2 or 3-to-1 advantage isn't there, which is not necessarily a guarantee of success, but tends to be kind of a planning factor, if you will. Generally, forces throughout history have wanted at least a 3-to-1 advantage before going on the attack. Moving on, talking about the home front, with some interesting pieces here, I thought. He said, since the military conflict in Ukraine is not an all-out war, the loser will not be the side who physically runs out of strength, but rather the ones who loses the will to fight sooner. What is important here is a clear vision of victory and a clear strategy for achieving it. That is, in my opinion, he is totally missing the Ukrainian perspective of this war. To say that this is not an all-out war, I don't know if that's supposed to be the concept that Russia hasn't gone all in. Maybe they haven't used nuclear weapons. They're holding back. And it's still a narrative I hear from time to time is that Russia's holding back. They're not going all in here. Russia is not, if you take nuclear weapons out of the conversation here, there's not a whole lot of areas you could say they're holding back on. Outside of full mobilization of the entire country, they're using just about all of their weapon systems, everything that makes sense, right? They're not flying bombers over Ukrainian territory because they get shot down. So they're operating within limitations, but those are limitations set by the Ukrainian military. So I very much disagree here. It is an all-out war, especially from the Ukrainian perspective. They're dodging cruise missiles and drone strikes nearly every day. So he says the loser will not be the side who physically runs out of strength, but rather the ones who loses the will to fight sooner. I think he's looking at that entirely through a Russian perspective and missing the perspective of the country that is defending their homeland. Continuing, he says, the conception of our victory is clear. We still need the demilitarization of Ukraine, a radical reduction of its army, neutral status for Kyiv, and a mechanism to control it, and the recognition of some form of territorial changes. So that's, tends to be rather consistent. If you go back to, before the war started, there's been some other parts added in there over time, for sure. But it does seem to generally match what we heard from Putin in the outset of the war. So again, demilitarization of Ukraine, personal opinion, that has failed horribly. Ukraine is now one of the largest and most advanced, well-equipped militaries in Europe. That could change, of course, if they end up losing the war. But the Ukrainian military, since this invasion, has become more capable, not less. So Russia really knocked it out of the park with that one. Neutral status for Kyiv. Nothing unique there. What they're getting at is not a part of NATO, potentially the European Union, but definitely not a part of NATO. That's what they're getting at when they say neutral status. And the recognition of some form of territorial changes. That's a fancy way of saying they want to keep the territory that they've taken so far, especially some of the areas in the east and the south where the front line has moved a little bit further into Ukrainian territory, and Russia has started to have some of these referendums in those areas. Sounds like they want to maintain that hold. The author says, although this concept of victory has not been articulated, it is intuitively clear. and society, although not very happy, has rallied and is ready, if not to participate directly, then to support or at least tolerate it. That's another big blind spot I think we have is how long will the Russian people put up with this war? My gut says, just based off of my loose understanding of Russian history, not an expert there, is that the Russian people are generally ready to put up with things longer than we think, and put up with a harder way of living or less economic activity than we might be in the West. I don't know if that's going to be long enough to see Russia through to victory in this war, but I think we tend to get that wrong. I think we tend to think that Russia and the Russian people are going to crack a lot earlier than they are. Hey, real quick, just wanted to say a huge thank you to the channel members. We've got the recent ones, A and Z boys, William and Joel joined in the last week or so. You guys are awesome. Just, your support helps me to continue to make more and hopefully better videos as we go forward. But gotta shout out some of the original guys here as well. Bert, Dave, and JD, been here from the start. Thank you all so much for the support. Getting back into the article here, the author gets into kind of how he thinks the war could wrap up here. He says, the West is faced with the choice to rally, to redouble and triple its efforts, or to quietly withdraw from the game. There is no third choice. The strategy of waiting, as we see in our case, only works if it is clear what you're waiting for. So the redouble or retriple its efforts comes to more military aid, more equipment. He hints at the idea that NATO troops, specifically Polish troops, could enter the fight. I don't think that's on the horizon anytime soon. I don't think the likelihood of that has increased, honestly, at all since the war kicked off. So it's really exclusively talking about Western aid for Ukraine or to withdraw, kind of back out entirely. That's where he sees it, kind of a binary choice for the West. Go all in or get out of here. Again, in his perspective, we failed. The United States, NATO, Western Europe, all of the backers of Ukraine and Ukraine have failed in this endeavor. So he's kind of presenting this as here's your way out, if you will. He says, to unite, the West needs the will, and it needs a clear goal, a new concept of victory, a dream to fight for. And I agree. I think there's not been a clear, concise, well-articulated, unified vision for what a concept of victory is for Ukraine. I think Ukraine has it. And of course, they're going to push for everything. Why wouldn't they? I would 100% if I were in their shoes. But when you see some of these claims of, or some of these ideas of, at the very least, the 2014 borders, all Russian troops removed from their territory, and, part of NATO or collective defense, and the, taking Crimea back under Ukrainian control. When you see Western officials pushed on those specifics, they kind of waffle. And they, well, it's up to Ukraine to determine what victory is. So in my opinion, when you get different entities ask that same question, you get different answers. And to me, that means there's not a very clear concept across the coalition, if you will. The author continues saying the West needs to freeze the conflict. From its perspective, it would be good if Kyiv won, but that is impossible, at least in its current state. So again, going back to the idea that the author has here that Russia has the upper hand, Ukraine's ability to wage war is dwindling, so the best hope that the West and Ukraine has right now is to lock it down, secure those lines, start building those defenses, don't let Russia take any more territory. He says this is the basis for meaningful negotiations that could begin this autumn or are already underway. The West's leverage could be the threat of its own direct intervention or the opening of a second front. I think he's missing the mark big time here. I don't know that any negotiations about an end to the war in Ukraine is going to be included with a threat of Poland or NATO or anybody opening up another front in a war with Russia. It seems like we got a long ways to go before we get there. I don't know if this is a product of maybe how NATO has been presented inside of Russia, but the idea that the United States, NATO, or anybody is going to threaten war with Russia unless they come to the negotiating table over Ukraine, I don't think that's anywhere close to being on the table. I think they're way off in that assessment. Now, the author kind of goes back and forth on a handful of things here. And I don't know, maybe it's the translation didn't come through perfectly. But, there's parts about how he thinks that the Russian military is clearly has the upper hand right now, and how the Ukrainian military is falling apart, and they're not going to get this double or tripling of aid from the West to continue fighting. And then he says, as the positional stalemate on the battlefield worsens, Moscow will be increasingly tempted to secure at least a tenuous peace. I don't know. I feel like we really haven't seen anything in that direction from Russia since, the early weeks or months of the conflict. when there were some negotiations. Where was that? In Turkey, I think it was. Since then, it seems like not even a suggestion of a negotiated peace. So, I don't know. Maybe this person's tied in with the Kremlin. Maybe that's something we'll see in the next few months, is some sort of, new opening of negotiations to try to end the war. We just haven't seen that at all. And he wraps up by saying, if we, talking about the Russian military, find a way to break through the defenses and break out of the stalemate, we will fight to victory. If not, we will have to think hard about what to do next. So he's kind of, leaping a ways ahead here. The idea of breaking through the Ukrainian defenses and break out of the stalemate, there's just not a lot that points to that being feasible in the next 6 to 12 months. Again, we have the big outlier of Ukrainian and Russian manpower available for this war. But if you take what we have so far in this conflict, and what the big thing that stands out is that both Ukraine and Russia have been pretty effective in the defense. So it's hard to imagine now, sitting here in September of 2023, that if Russia were to put together an offensive in the next 3 months, that they would somehow this time break through the Ukrainian lines and march all the way to Kyiv. It seems unlikely. Big picture, kind of stepping back, my take on this article is that it presents some interesting points. And I love seeing kind of what people inside of Russia, especially those that are studying the conflict and trying to keep up with it, what they think the future might look like here. There's some realistic aspects to this, right? The idea that it could end in a tenuous peace, or that, the United States and NATO might at some point have to start pressing Ukraine to come to the negotiating table. I think all of that is within the realm of possibility. I do think the author is just a little optimistic in Russia's favor here, which is, is to be expected, right? It's a Russian writing in a Russian think tank for a Russian audience. So if there's going to be a bias, it's probably going to be leaning in Russia's favor more so than you might find in, the United States, United Kingdom, Ukraine, anywhere else. But anyways, I think it's always interesting to get a look at how this war is being presented inside of Russia. Just, whether you agree with everything, nothing, or something in between about what this author says, I think it helps, create a better understanding of the overall war. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.